Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
First, let me ask you. Help me understand what is stopping you from financially forward thinking. Let's go.
Yeah, wake up, check the bank account. Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new. Generous is what I do. Walking down the leasing street. Cycle that I just repeat. Money rushing left and right. Gone before the end of night. Don't know the route, don't know the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's impressively rap, but it's still a trap.
forward thinking, not today. Tendency is to stay. Generous contributions flow. Helping get investment grow. Legal term, legal term, legal term. Up in the police so firm. Legal term, legal term, legal term. Letting all my money burn. Hold up, pause the beat. You're making that generous monthly contribution, but are you building your legacy? Whether it's your first home or move up.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah, justified, stuck in comfort, stuck in fear. That's why I'm staying here. If the pipe begins to leak, I don't even have to speak. But who pays for it really? But that comfort as a cost. Not the equity I lost. While I sit here paying rent, my future cash is already spent. Some days fast, some days slow. That's just how the tenants go. But if you listen to the sound, it's your money. Don't let it hit the ground, call me.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Every check that I have sent vanished in the void of red.
Stop the vanishing act.
Forward thinking, that's the key to break the chain of tendency. Stop the generous supply. It is time for me to buy. Let's legal term, legal term, legal term. How I make the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah. Don't perpetuate yourself in Tennessee. Make the move. William Karpeh. Helping you buy, sell, and invest with confidence. Pick up the phone, let's change the path. Call or text me. 1651-33044.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Let's make it simple. Let's make it smart. Forward thinking. Forward living. Yeah. It's time to talk about the elephant in the room. This shit William Karpeh. You're a real tough. We talking Minnesota.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
But first, let me ask you. Help me understand.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Money rushing left and right. Gone before the end of night.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Shit, William Karpeh. You're real good.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
But first, let me ask you.
Help me understand what is stopping you from financially forward thinking. Let's go.
Yeah, wake up, check the bank account. Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new. Generous is what I do. Walking down the leasing street. Cycle that I just repeat. Money rushing left and right. Gone before the end of night. Don't know the route, don't know the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's impressively rap, but it's still a trap.
forward thinking, not today. Tendency is get them stay. Generous contributions flow. Helping that investment grow. Legal term, legal term. Wrapped up in the piece so firm. Legal term, legal term. Letting all my money burn. Hold up, pause the beat. You're making that generous monthly contribution. But are you building your legacy? Whether it's your first home or move up.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah, justify, yeah. Stuck in comfort, stuck in fear. That's why I'm staying here. If the pipe begins to leak, I don't even have to speak. But who pays for it really? But that comfort as a cost. Count the equity I lost. While I sit here paying rent, my future cash is already spent. Some days fast, some days slow. That's just how the tenants go. But if you listen to the sound, it's your money. Don't let it hit the ground, call me.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Helping them investment grow. Legal term, wrapped up in a piece so firm. Legal term, letting know my money.
All right. Okay, we have the Honorable Mayor here in the house, and so
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
We are going to bring you out the Honorable Mayor into this.
Stop the vanishing eye.
All right. I can hear you back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Can you send this to my email? Because for whatever reason, it's not working on my computer.
Yeah, sure. Definitely, I can do that.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah. Don't perpetuate yourself in Tennessee. Take the move. William Karpeh. Helping you buy, sell, and invest with confidence. Pick up the phone, let's change the path. Call or text me. 1651-33044.
Every month you send a call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
But first, let me ask you.
I'm online,
Help me
so
understand what is stopping you from financially forward thinking. Let's go.
Yeah, wake up, check the bank account. Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new.
you try.
Generous is what I do. Walking down the leasing
You
street.
try it one other place.
Just repeat. Money rushing left and right. Gone before the end of night. Don't know the route, don't know the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's impressively rap, but it's still a trap.
forward thinking, not today. Tendency is get them stay. Generous contributions flow. Helping that investment grow. Legal term.
Yeah, it's weird. It's only allowing it to pull up on my phone. Let me try one last thing.
I'm sending it to your email right now.
You're making that generous monthly contribution. But are you building your legacy? Whether it's your first home or move up.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a
Okay.
generous contribution to someone else's
Log
future.
off. I think I figured it out.
Stuck in comfort, stuck in fear. That's why I'm staying here. If the pipe begins to leak, I don't even have to speak. But who pays
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Okay, I'm on, but it seems like the cameras.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
I think we are there twice. So we are getting...
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the anticipated show is now live as we have the Honorable Mayor in the house who's going to be telling you all about what is coming to Brooklyn Park.
All right. Well, thank you for having me.
Yep. Welcome to Innovation Inside, the podcast that explores groundbreaking developments shaping our future. Today we have a truly exciting topic. Arguably, you will agree with me, the Brooklyn Park BioTech Innovation District will be diving deep into this ambitious project, which aims to transform Brooklyn Park into a global leader in the biotechnology. To guide us through this will be referencing the presentation title, the Brooklyn Park BioTech Innovation District, a path to international wealth, presented by no other but the Honorable Mayor Hollies J. Winston on this April 23rd, 2026.
Say again. Oh, I'm sorry, you went out.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Honorable?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, all right. So let's start at the very, very beginning now with the overarching vision for this district. According to the presentation on page 1, and I'll get presentation 1 on the screen for everyone to see. On page 1, the Brooklyn Park BioTech Innovation District is introduced as a transformative engine. Can you help us understand? Can you elaborate on what this means for the region?
So I would say that this strategy that we're pursuing comes out of our city of Brooklyn Park. If we benchmark ourselves versus a Bloomington has maybe 5.5 billion in commercial property values. Brooklyn Park has maybe 2.3 billion. So it's about a $2.5 to $3 billion gap in terms of commercial property values. Well, the commercial property values provide tax revenue to the city so we can do stuff for youth, for seniors, communities, parks, everything that we need, police, public safety. And so because of that gap, we have to find a way to cover that gap. Bloomington is only a few thousand people bigger than us, so it shouldn't be a $2.5 to $3 billion gap. So we have 700 acres of undeveloped land in Brooklyn Park, though. We also exist along what they call the medical alley corridor. So from Plymouth through Maple Grove, through Brooklyn Park, through Fridley, you have a ton of medical device companies. And so we said we would tap into our location and we would take 200 acres of that and turn it into a biotech engine, right? Which transforms our tax revenue, brings retail, brings restaurants, brings jobs, housing. So that's really what we mean in terms of a transformative engine. Every city has to be able to afford itself, and Brooklyn Park has struggled to do that since it's been in existence.
All right. For those of you who are perpetuating yourselves in tenancy, just making those general contributions on a monthly basis, help me understand this 2026. What is stopping you from financially forward thinking and perpetuating yourselves in tenancy? Just making those generous contributions that you call rent. Now, that sounds incredibly comprehensive. Moving on to page 2. Okay, let's get page 2 on. Moving on to page 2 of the presentation, we learn about the Northwest Growth Area and its strategic vision. Now, what makes this particular location in Brooklyn Park so ideal for such an ambitious project? I mean, help me understand.
Mhm. Well, I think I touched on a little bit of it earlier, right? It's 15 to 20 minutes away from Minneapolis, which is a major metropolitan area, right? A little further from St. Paul, but it's to have 700 acres that's undeveloped that far from that's that close to a metropolitan area is almost unheard of, because when you have prime land, you generally people want to develop it to make their own profit, but also the city develops it so that they can afford their particular city. So it's not a full 700 acres. Well, the Northwest Growth Area is 700 acres, but the biotech is more 200 acres, which is incredibly important. And then when we talk about highway access, right, this area is right in 610, 169. But up the street, not that far away, is Highway 94. So we're near a number of major highways, which is important if you're if you live within an area or you need to work there, right, you can get to where you need to get to in the Twin Cities area relatively quickly. You have access to it. But for people who are shipping out or bringing in, having access to major highways is incredibly important, right? And I think that the global connectivity piece will, we do have a few companies from Japan, right? So we're looking to say, well, as we do this biotech, as we do medical devices, right, we bring those into our city. How can we also invite those who are, who are willing to come to Brooklyn Park and make it a welcoming place?
All right, all right. I mean, that sounds very, very ambitious. And so, I mean, it's not just about the land, okay, those undeveloped land that you talked about, but also the connectivity. Now, let's zoom in on the what? On the core of this initiative, the Biotech Innovation District itself. On page 3, what is its legislative foundation and what are the core industry sectors it aims to attract?
Yes, I would just say, if you look at the easiest way to explain it, if people know about Mayo Clinic, which is the, premier hospital, right, within the United States of America, or hospital system. They exist in Rochester, Minnesota. And I want to say they're the 4th largest city, but they didn't start out that way. So what happened is, as they built Mayo and built that expertise, they went to the state and they said, hey, listen, we want to create a destination medical here, which will support Mayo Clinic with grants, with resources, with state level designation, right? So we've got the same thing now designated for Brooklyn Park, the Biotech District. So when we think of biotech, we need to get to a point, the state is saying we need to get to a point where we think of a Brooklyn Park. We think of investment, Brooklyn Park. When we think of maybe special tax increment financing or grants, or there's something they call Port Authority access, which allows us to do a different type of bonding, right, to allow us to incentivize businesses to come here. That's what they mean by the legislative foundation. That's a big part of the legislative foundation. So that's where it comes from. As far as the core industry sectors, right, biotech, advanced medical manufacturing, pharmaceutical production, those all really fit into that biotech piece. We've already got some companies that are doing that in Brooklyn Park, but also in the region. So we just want to encourage more of them to come here.
All right, all right. I mean, that's a very, very powerful vision for an economic impact. Now, let's turn to page 4 of our presentation here. Okay. Is it page 4? Yeah. Which discusses what? Driving economic prosperity and community development through key impact metrics and growth projections. Now, what kind of tangible benefits can the community expect from this development?
I'm not seeing the slide. I don't know if you need that. There we go. So I would just say, the actual facilities, right, will bring jobs. So we're projecting 5,000 to 10,000 jobs here. So people in the city will be able to access those jobs. We've got a youth program, Brooklyn, that trains youth to be able to access those type of jobs. So I think that's going to be an important piece, is just employing our own community. You employ youth when they hit 23, 24, 25, right? It keeps them on the right path, moving in the right direction. But also 3,000 to 5,000 housing units. So, there's a housing crisis across the Twin Cities. But we want to create housing for seniors, for folks who are moving up in life, and then for folks who are getting started as well. And this, when you put this many jobs here and you put this type of development, it incentivizes developers to come and build, more houses and homes. The other thing is that people talk about retail and restaurants. Well, when you bring major biotech companies here or R&D companies here with a good number of employees, that creates incentive for restaurants and retail to be there, because those people who work there may go to the restaurants, and then the new people who are moving in may go to the retail and the restaurants and some of the entertainment. So that is what the residents get out of it. The other piece is, when we talk about tax revenue, when you cover a $2 to $3 billion gap, the taxes that come from that, some of them go towards the new development, but the majority end up going to the rest of the city, right? So that it helps push down taxes for people who actually live in Brooklyn Park. Now you've got this extra commercial revenue. You can use that to push down taxes, or it can help to finance many of the things that the city wants or needs. And when I say city, I mean the residents, right? They ask for more parks, they ask for more amenities, they ask for more youth programming and senior programming. So this helps to pay for that.
All right. And for those of you who are perpetuating yourselves in tenancy, just making those generous contributions on a monthly basis that you call rent, I call it generous contribution. Help me understand this 2026. What is stopping you from financially forward thinking? As we have here in studio, the Honorable City Mayor of Brooklyn Park, telling us about the Technological Innovation Hub. Do not sit on the fence. Do not delay, but get in the game, okay? And so it's clear that this is a well thought out plan. Let's go to page 5. Let's see what we have there on page 5, okay? The presentation introduces the role of the Municipal Innovation District and the EDA, with Mayor Hollies J. Winston as the EDA president and strategic lead. Now, how does the EDA contribute to the success of this district?
Say that again. How does the EDA?
How does the EDA contribute to the success of this district, Brooklyn Park?
Oh, the Economic Development Authority. So the Economic Development Authority is part of, the group that works with planning and works with housing and economic development, right? To create the overall structure for this biotech district, as well as the Northwest growth area, right? So they, in terms of zoning, in terms of planning that fits under this particular group. But also when we talk about the EDA, which EDA can make loans, it can invest in certain things. It can invest in certain things, right? I think that helps to, when we go to the Capitol and we push for things, they're doing a lot of the research to help the Capitol understand why we need this investment, these particular dollars. I think when we talk about aligning city resources, right, we have a steering committee that a number of people, business owners, civic leaders, and other leaders throughout the community, they sit on that steering committee. And so they're finding ways, we're starting to find ways to create a model that, brings private dollars and capital and innovation into this particular district, right? And the EDA kind of sits at the center of aligning and bringing all those resources together so we can collaborate, and then we can have a successful Biotech Innovation District.
All right. Now let's look at our next slide. Connecting local innovation to global markets, referencing page 6. The ambition extends beyond local impact to global reach. And page 6 delves into connecting local innovation to global markets through a global logistics strategy and international wealth creation. How will Brooklyn Park achieve this international connectivity?
Well, I think, a lot of it has to do with just incentivizing the businesses to come here. If you have a good plan, a lot of the biotech companies or med device companies, they're looking for where they put their corporation headquarters, or they're looking for where they put a branch of that. and they really want a place that's welcoming, whether there's tax incentives, whether it's places people can have their employees can enjoy themselves, or it's a city council that's amenable to helping them make that a place where their business can be successful and comfortable. I think that's how you do it. I think, you talk about market access, right? A lot of the international consumers and distributors, that's what their marketing companies do. And in terms of cross-border partnerships, right? I think for us to do that, that's something where we incentivize people to come. Supply chain integration, again, that's going to be, yes, we can assist with that in terms of highways and roads and streets, right? But a lot of that relies on the companies having the expertise to do it. I think from a incentivization perspective, right? That's the biggest tool that we have as a city, whether it's the tax increment financing or port authority, or how we can work with these particular companies. It's incentivizing them to come here. And some of the incentivization doesn't cost money. Some of it, if they see that other biotech companies are coming here, they want to be here because they want to have access to the talent that comes with biotech. If somebody leaves one biotech company, they're going to another biotech company often, right? And so you want that placed in a similar location. So that's really, I think that's what this slide is talking about, is over time you want to create that particular ecosystem where companies are comfortable coming here.
All right. This is where the path to our international wealth truly comes into play, as detailed on this slide and expressed by our honorable mayor himself. Now let us look at what? Slide 7, okay? It says what? Turning knowledge into keys, a powerful motto indeed. And as we approach the conclusion, page 7 presents what? A vision for future innovation and growth. What is the ultimate promise of this district for long term?
Mm-hmm. So I think, from a number of perspectives, right? Again, from a city perspective, one of the big incentives for this is providing jobs to local residents. I mean, like I said, we have a program, Brooklink, that really helps with that. But it's also just helping to economically stabilize the city by bringing this tax revenue here that we can use to plug some gaps and then to get some of the amenities that people are looking for. I think the retail and the restaurants in terms of quality of life, right, is a transformation that once you start seeing more of that in Brooklyn Park, other people want to move here, they want to stay here because they're beginning to get some of the amenities that they want. As far as the global connectivity, again, we can make this an amenable place for businesses to live, to succeed, to thrive. A lot of that positioning, when you're talking about these big, Fortune 500 or Fortune 2000 companies, right? They have the expertise there to understand what they need to do internationally. I think for us, it's when working with the various school districts to say, listen, we have programming like Brooklyn programming that can get youth into these jobs, but also how do we work with our school boards and our school districts to say, how can we embed this into the school system where there's some training or there's a pipeline that we know that if a kid shows an indication at 12 or 13 years old that they're interested in this type of work, there's a system that gets them from school into Brooklink or into school programming all the way to, whether it's a tech school or a college school. And then from there, if they get their 2-year associates, they can work within the city of Brooklyn Park, right? So for us, right, that's the transformation that we're looking for, is putting money in people's pockets, giving them incentive to move in the right direction, bringing that development. So we get the tax revenue, we get the retail, we get the restaurants, we get people who are buying homes here who want to stay here long term and who can invest, right? So for me, that's the important piece, the global connectivity. That more so comes from the expertise of the businesses. We do have a partnership with Greater MSP, which stands for Greater Minneapolis St. Paul. They help to incentivize companies or to come to the metro area, or they help to bring large businesses and they look at the different trends that are occurring and they say, okay, this is what we need to do to help bring those businesses here or to keep them here or to strengthen that ecosystem, right? So we're working with them and they would have a little bit more expertise in terms of that overall global connectivity as well. So some of this will be the businesses, some will be partnership with greater MSP, and some will be us setting the stage.
All right. And finally, on page 8, we reach the conclusion. Let us get page 8 here. We reach the conclusion. A model for what? Future prosperity. What is the final message, Mayor Winston, Honorable Mayor Winston, and the EDA want to convey? I mean, help us understand.
Yeah, I would say that, again, it's about, from the city perspective, right? Building an apparatus that builds wealth within the community, but also brings enough value that it helps close that commercial value gap, brings the tax revenue that we're looking for as a city, and then helps us just make sure that we are long-term viable city, right? We don't want to be in a situation where to continue as a city, we have to cut essential services, right? And public safety takes up maybe 60% of our budget, which is a large portion. At some point, it should be lower. This allows us to begin bringing in the tax revenue to push that down. You know, you can also have a sales tax if we realize that there's enough people coming from outside of the city that are buying goods and services, right? We can have a sales tax on that, but we don't necessarily want to do that yet because it would be what they call regressive. So we'd basically be taxing ourselves. So I think from that city perspective, it's making us a sustainable city. For our residents, it's creating wealth, but it's also creating just the living experience they want in terms of retail, in terms of restaurants, right? Those are things people have been asking for quite some time. This is a model that helps deliver it.
Well, thank you very much for that incredible, insightful overview. I mean, it's clear that Brooklyn Park Biotech Innovation District is a meticulously planned and highly ambitious project with the potential to bring significant economic and social benefits to the region and beyond. We've covered the entire presentation page by page, and it's truly compelling vision. Thank you for joining us on this Innovation Insight. Thank you very much, Honorable. I mean, it was a pleasure talking to you and having you today. I mean, it took a considerable effort when you were back in Africa and I was negotiating you. Being here and giving a word, about, unfortunately, several guests, that have given me the word, but not honor it. But you did that. Okay, so I'm highly delighted. Thank you very much once again. And I hope to have you here in the future.
Yes. Yeah, we can do it in the future. We can have a panel. Just let me know. I appreciate you reaching out, man. And thank you for the work you do trying to educate the community, or educating the community on, finance, what they need to do in terms of a home. So I appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Break the chain of tendency, stop the trend of oversupply. It is time for me to buy. Let's turn. How I make the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Honorable was part of the country in Africa, and I was negotiating for having me on this platform. Give me a So for those of you who are perpetuating yourselves in tenancy, just making those generous contributions on a monthly basis. I mean, help me understand.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
If you have that there, right? Every month you send that check. You call it what? Rent? Yes, that's a generous contribution that you are making. Towards what? The bank balance of another man. And you did not cross the Atlantic Ocean to become a salvation army. So getting a game. There's great things coming for Brooklyn Park as we are ready to transform yourself into what? A high-paying employee.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Well, we understand that this 2026, I mean, what is stopping you
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Back to back. Help me understand.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
First, let me ask you. Help me understand what is stopping you from financially forward thinking. Let's go.
Yeah, wake up, check the bank account. Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new. Generous is what I do. Walking down the leasing street. Cycle that I just repeat. Money rushing left and right. Gone before the end of night. Don't know the route, don't know the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's impressively rap, but it's still a trap.
forward thinking, not too late. Tendency is get them stay. Generous contributions flow. Helping that investment grow. They gon' turn, they gon' turn, they gon' turn. Wrapped up in the police so firm. They gon' turn, they gon' turn, they gon' turn. Letting all my money burn. Hold up, pause the beat. You're making that generous monthly contribution. But are you building your legacy? Whether it's your first home or move up.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah, justify, yeah. Stuck in comfort, stuck in fear. That's why I'm staying here. If the pipe begins to leak, I don't even have to speak. But who pays for it really? But that comfort as a cost. Not the equity I lost. While I sit here paying rent, my future cash is already spent. Some days fast, some days slow. That's just how the tenants go. But if you listen to the sound, it's your money. I'm letting it ground call me.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's the future that you lose. Every check that I have sent, vanished in the void of red.
Stop the vanishing act.
Yeah. Forward thinking, that's the key to break the chain of tendency. Stop the generous supply. It is time for me to buy. Let's turn. How I make the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah. Don't perpetuate yourself in Tennessee. Make the move. William Karpeh. Helping you buy, sell, and invest with confidence. Pick up the phone, let's change the path. Call or text me. 1651-33044.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Let's make it simple. Let's make it smart. Forward thinking. Forward living. No. Yeah. It's time to talk about the elephant in the room. Shit, William Karpeh. You're a real talk. We talking Minnesota.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
But first, let me ask you. Help me understand.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Let me ask you. Help me understand what is stopping you from financially forward thinking. Let's go.
Yeah, wake up, check the bank account. Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new. Generous is what I do. Walking down the leasing street. Cycle that I just repeat. Money rushing left and right. Gone before the end of night. Don't know the roof, don't know the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's impressively rap, but it's still a trap.
forward thinking, not too late. Tendency is get them stay. Generous contributions flow. Helping get investment grow. They gon' turn, they gon' turn. Wrapped up in a piece so firm. They gon' turn, they gon' turn. Letting all my money burn. Hold up, pause the beat. You're making that generous monthly contribution. But are you building your legacy? Whether it's your first home or move up.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah, justify, yeah. Stuck in comfort, stuck in fear. That's why I'm staying here. If the pipe begins to leak, I don't even have to speak. But who pays for it really? But that comfort as a cost. Not the equity I lost. While I sit here paying rent, my future cash is already spent. Some days fast, some days slow. That's just how the tenants go. But if you listen to the sound, it's your money. I'm letting it in the ground, call me.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Helping them investment grow. They gon' turn, we gon' turn. Wrapped up in a piece so firm. They gon' turn, we gon' turn. Letting all my money burn. We pay a mortgage every month. It's a fact, it isn't blunt. The only question left to
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's the future that you lose. Every check that I have sent vanished in the void of rent.
Stop the vanishing act.
Yeah. Forward thinking, that's the key to break the chain of tendency. Stop the generous supply. It is time for me to buy. Let's turn, we gon' turn. How I make the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Yeah. Don't perpetuate yourself in tendency. Make the move. William Karpeh. Helping you buy, sell, and invest with confidence. Pick up the phone, let's change the path. Call or text me. 1651-33044.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Let's make it simple. Let's make it smart. Forward thinking. Forward living. No. Yeah. It's time to talk about the elephant.
Contribution to someone else's future.
Buy, sell, and invest with confidence.
But first, let me ask you. Help me understand what is stopping you from financially forward thinking. Let's go.
Yeah, wake up, check the bank account. Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new. Generous is what I do. Walking down the leasing street. Cycle that I just repeat. Money rushing left and right. Gone before the end of night. Don't know the roof, don't know the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
It's impressively rap, but it's still a trap.
forward thinking, not too late. Tendency is get them stay. Generous contributions flow. Helping get investment grow. They gon' turn, they gon' turn.
Yeah, I think that time is still
making that generous monthly contribution. But are you building your legacy? Whether it's your first home or move up.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
That's why I'm staying here. If the pipe begins to leak, I don't even have to speak. Who pays for it really? But that comfort is a call. Not the equity I lost. While I sit here paying rent, my future cash is already spent. Some days fast, some days slow. That's just how the times go. But if you listen to the sound, it's your money.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Every check that I have sent vanished in the void of red. Stop the vanishing eye. Forward thinking, that's the key to break the chain of tendency. Stop the agenda, resupply. It is time for me to buy. Let's turn. How I make the
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Don't perpetuate yourself in Tennessee. Make the move. William Karpeh. Helping you buy, sell, and invest with confidence. Pick up the phone, let's change the path.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Let's make it simple. Forward thinking. It's time to talk about the elephant in the room. Shit, William Karpeh, the real talk. We talking Minnesota.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
But first, let me ask you. Help me understand.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future. Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Okay, bro. Come here online. I just how they got on the line.
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
But first, let me ask you. Help me understand what is stopping you from financially forward thinking. Let's go.
Wake up, check the bank account. Watch the numbers running out. Send the check to someone new. Generous is what I do. Walking down the leasing street. Cycle that I just repeat. Money rushing
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
Making that generous monthly contribution. Are you building your legacy? Whether it's your first home or move
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
We are still on the ground.
Stuck in comfort, stuck in fear. That's why I'm staying here. If the pipe begins to leak, I don't even have to speak. But who pays for it really? But that comfort as a cost. Not the equity I lost. While I sit here paying rent, my future cash is already spent. Some days fast, some days slow. That's just how the tenants go. But if you listen to the sound,
Every month you send a check. You call it rent. I call it a generous contribution to someone else's future.
contributions flow.